Good afternoon. Are you interested in the art of music? Let me tell you about this podcast that is about music. I've been listening to this music review podcast known as Dissect. I'm interested in listening to this podcast because it dives into the deeper meanings of the types of music that artists have put out throughout their careers. The podcast started on August 22nd, 2016, with the first season being released, which contained 21 episodes. The first season dives deep into the meaning of the themes of To Pimp a Butterfly, an album by Kendrick Lamar. The host of the podcast is known as Cole Kushner. In each episode, he dives deep into each track of the album and tells you layer by layer, what each song means. The format for the podcast is scripted, and Cole Kushner is the only speaker on the show. The podcast is most definitely for music fans. One reason that I really enjoy listening to this podcast is because it discusses how music can be more than something that you just listen to every now and then. Music is a form of art. There are almost an unlimited amount of themes that can be discussed in music. Cole Kushner does this by spending time the first season discussing what I think is the greatest album of all time, To Pimp a Butterfly. Kushner spends these 21 episodes, these 21 30-minute long episodes of the show discussing his opinions and the facts stated and the art and suggestions that are known in each track of To Pimp a Butterfly. I would recommend that you listen to this album a couple times before listening to the podcast. However, it is noted that you do not have to listen to the album to still find this podcast enjoyable. If you are familiar with the album and you are a big fan of it, I feel that you will find this podcast very interesting. Kushner plays the parts of the track and dissects the lyrics word for word so he can uncover what the lyrics mean exactly. Even if you know a lot about To Pimp a Butterfly, you think you understand everything about the album, I'm sure you will discover something new listening to this podcast. The podcast does not end after the first season, however. Cole Kushner is still making this podcast today. Dissect is currently on its 5th season, with Cole Kushner covering albums such as My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye West, Flower Boy by Tyler the Creator, and Blonde by Frank Ocean. I've only listened to the first season, but I love these albums and I plan to listen to the rest of the show. I find that Kushner chose these albums because they are crafted with many different layers to look into. If you are looking to listen to something that is very suspenseful or comical, this podcast is not for you. This is specifically informing and, in my opinion, an educational podcast. Listeners must focus on the podcast and take into what Kushner is saying to fully understand and appreciate this podcast. Another thing I will say is that there is explicit language and dialogue in this podcast, so make sure that a mature audience is listening. I really find the first season of Dissect to be very enjoyable. The first season of Dissect is very appealing to me for several reasons. To Pimp a Butterfly is one of my favorite albums of all time, and listening to Kushner dissect it is really great and enjoyable. I find that he can understand the meaning of this album in a way that nobody else can. And he also talks about my favorite artist, Kendrick Lamar. Kendrick Lamar is a very talented musical artist, and Cole Kushner proves this in the first season of Dissect. Another reason why I think this podcast is very interesting is that it can be listened for free on Spotify. Sometimes it is very struggling to find a podcast that is free to download on different audio streaming services, but this one can be listened to on an app that you also listen to with your music. In conclusion, Dissect is a podcast that is hosted by Cole Kushner, in which albums are broken down layer by layer in each season. I hope you've taken into account what I've said, and I hope you decide to give this podcast a listen. Thank you.